I have a theory based on no science whatsoever from the University of, I reckon. It seems to me that people who are looking at electric cars are a lot more brand agnostic than they ever have been. When people are looking at electric, they tend to think about the more practical stuff. Is it big enough? Has it got enough range? Will it do what I need it to do? Rather than whether it has a so-called premium badge.
That puts traditional car makers on the back foot a bit. Imagine if you're Mercedes, BMW or Audi and you can't rely on the badge to sell the car for you. Well, not entirely anyway. Suddenly, people are raving about Kias and Hyundais. How awkward.
So my question today is, exactly what are we paying for here? These three cars are all physically quite similar, but intellectually very different. And what I want to know is, are you influenced by brands? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because that's how we know you're paying attention. These three cars all look very different, but they are pretty much identical underneath. They have the same chassis, they have the same batteries, they have the same motors, they've all got just over 200 brake horsepower, and they all drive the rear wheels. They've got very, very similar ranges, and yet they are different specifications and very different prices because they're from different brands. Now, specifications will make a bit of difference, so for this one, we're just going to talk in generalities.
First of all, I need to explain a bit about the platform on which a car is based, and that some cars share certain bits underneath that you can't see. Well, Volkswagen developed a basic structure for an electric car called the MEB platform. In German, it's called Modulare E-Antriebsbaukasten. Sorry about the pronunciation, Germany. That basically translates as modular e-drive toolkit. Now that's basically like a set of elements that can be used for lots of different applications, because it's been designed from the off to be flexible and not deal with all the stuff you need to package for a car with an engine. So it can take one or two motors for 2 or 4-wheel drive, different sizes of battery, even be stretched or squashed to make different sizes of car. And it can also be used by different brands as the basic ingredient for their own product, because sharing this stuff cuts manufacturing costs and increases choice, and that's important. So the MEB platform appears in various guises. In fact, all of the bespoke electric models from VW, ŠKODA and Audi feature it in one form or another, and VW is collaborating with companies like Ford to share the MEB platform even further in the future.
So that's why you end up with the ŠKODA Enyaq, the VW ID.4 and the Audi Q4 e-tron all having very similar specs and sizes. And they all charge at the same rate because they've got the same charging equipment. So they've got 11 kilowatt AC charging and 135 kilowatt DC charging, which means you'll get from 10 to 80% in about 33 minutes for all of them on a big enough rapid charger, and it'll take about an hour and 10 minutes on a more common 50 kilowatt. They are all the same. So that means you have to dig a little bit more to find the differences. Now, interestingly, on the official WLTP cycle, that ŠKODA Enyaq gets up to 331 miles of range, whereas the VW and the Audi only get 313. Now, in the real world, that's probably going to be 260 miles for the Enyaq, with the other two being 10 less, but let's face it, the difference is largely negligible. The issues come because different specs and different wheel sizes will have an effect on how far you can go, but largely they're still the same.
That's subtle stuff though. Less subtle is just working out which one you prefer the look of. Now, beauty being in the eye of the beholder and all that, which one do you think looks more classy or expensive? Let us know in the comments. The Audi looks smaller, less blocky, with quite a serious face and more curves. Does it look more expensive? Sort of. But that's probably because we know that Audi is supposed to be more expensive. It's the weight of prejudice working for traditionally more costly brands. The ID.4 is a nice enough shape, but it does tend towards the blobby at times. This is VW looking for a new direction for its electric-only ID brand, and it kind of works, even if it does feel sometimes a little bit bland. The ŠKODA, on the other hand, is definitely less slinky but has a nice chiselled look. There are straighter edges where the ID.4 has curves, a slightly more industrial vibe. It's definitely the one with the strongest jaw.
In terms of raw boot space, the Enyaq has 585 litres with the seats all in place, and then there's a little section under here in which you can store your cables. The VW ID.4 has 543 litres, which is still pretty big, and it's got a little false floor section, again for storing your cables. But the Audi Q4 e-tron is notably smaller. That section in there is just 520 litres. Now that's plenty for family duties, but it's noticeably smaller, even with a false floor, which means that if you've got to carry loads and loads of stuff in your boot under a cover, the Enyaq is the clear winner. As for the insides, I actually think the Audi is pretty slick. You get this big sweep of silver across the dash, a small information screen in front of you, and then the bigger touchscreen in the centre. But they're integrated into the dash, so everything is set into the dashboard rather than being stuck on. It's got a non-circular steering wheel, which I always find quite interesting, but I like the way the shapes feel quite designery. And also the graphics on the Audi, weirdly, are fast and fuss-free. This is definitely one of the better systems. Then you've got some often used buttons just underneath the touchscreen, which are for the aircon, that kind of thing, and a floating sort of center console here, which incorporates the gear selector, which is like a little lozenge, and then a little iPad style controller for the stereo, which is good. It's also got the world's largest hazard button. It's literally 4 inches long, which is quite interesting. Loads of storage down here, couple of charging points and a 12-volt, cup holders, central door bin. It's all fairly standard. One of the things we are going to introduce at this point though is the Electrifying.com quality measuring instrument. Now these, in theory, are built by the Swiss. They're a very precision element. They're not something I've just found in the barn. This will just give us a little idea as to whether this interior really is quality or whether it just looks nice. So we'll start with the centre of the steering wheel. Yeah, that's pretty solid. Bit of centre console. Yeah. Oh, that plastic there isn't so great. But on the door cards, everything's pretty solid. And also, there's the all-important door shut test. Come with me.
Okay, Wookie, got it. Wookie, relax. Relax. Wookie, it's okay. It's okay.
As for the ŠKODA, well, I actually think this is possibly a little bit nicer, a little bit more my kind of thing than the Audi. It's got a small information screen in front of you. The windscreen is quite a long way away. It feels like it's quite a nosy car. And then stuck up in the middle of the dash, and certainly less integrated in the Audi, is a big touchscreen. Like the Audi though, it has physical buttons for oft-used things underneath it, and then a really good sort of 2-level centre console. So you've got wireless charging pads here, cup holders, a big storage tray. You will notice that the gear shift selector is here, and it is identical to the one in the Audi. And then there's a big open space underneath and a central console here, which again has 2 levels. It's a very spacious feeling car, and I think it feels more practical, like the ŠKODA has made more use of the interior space than Audi does. It's more similar to the VW ID.4 in the way that the centre console sticks up, but I like the ŠKODA. I think it's quite funky, but very practical. But how about quality? Well, let's do some unscientific science. Okay, ready, steering wheel? I think it's quite good, you know. The bits that you can see and touch are actually soft touch, so that's pretty good. And even the centre console has got padding on it. It's not bad. I think that's a bit cheap, but generally the Enyaq's pretty good. Time to test the doors. Also good.
Okay, you can stop now, Wookie.
As for the ID.4, well, I happen to think it's actually the worst of the 3. I know that's a strong statement to make, and it does initially feel quite fresh and quite interesting, but where the Audi and the ŠKODA both have a little lozenge of a gear stick down here, the Volkswagen has this familiar now rotary control on the right hand side of this little binnacle up here. So when you want to select drive, you rock it forwards, and when you want to select reverse, you rock it backwards. And then the same again for the regen mode, the B mode. Then a big touchscreen in the middle. So in that sense, those bits resemble the ŠKODA, but then it's got a completely independent center console, and some of it just doesn't feel very good. The plastics still have slightly sharp edges, especially under here where this shutter door goes. And even though it's quite clear and nice, when I've been playing with it, this touchscreen is incredibly laggy. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And because it doesn't go very quickly, you sometimes press things twice and then it does 2 actions at once. So it's quite frustrating as an interior. I think this would look good on pictures, but in practice, it's not great. So, time for the quality hammerette thing. That sounds quite hollow to me. I mean, the bits where there's dash pads is fine, but some of this just doesn't feel very nice. It's an interesting one. Also, one of my pet hates on this car, it's got only 2 window switches here, and if you want to open the rear windows, you press a button in front of them, but actually that switch doesn't work all the time, so sometimes you press it in the wrong order and lower the back windows when you want to lower the fronts. That's weird when you're in a car park trying to get a ticket out of the machine. It's got these haptic buttons on the steering wheel. Sometimes when I'm turning, I actually press them by accident, so I'm switching things on and off all the time, and then when I want to change something, they don't work. It's a really quite a frustrating thing from Volkswagen. It looks better than it is. But how about the door test? Ever so slightly more tinny, I do feel. What do you think? Okay, so I'm going to drive exactly the same route in all 3 cars and try and see if I can smell any particular difference. I've got a decibel meter, which is basically just an app on my phone, in the same position in each car. I've got the fans set to 2, and I'm going to do the same speeds when I do the sound tests. But basically, this is not proper science, it's drive-by science, just to see if there's any huge variation. Try and give us an idea where these cars differ. So I'm going to slow down here, and I'm going to do exactly 30 miles an hour, and I'm going to go quiet for a few seconds. So the Audi is registering at 30 miles an hour on this bit of road, 28 miles an hour, about 75 to 80 decibels. And it says it sounds like a vacuum cleaner. And if that sounds like a vacuum cleaner, then it's a very quiet vacuum cleaner. Funnily enough, it says when I'm speaking that my voice is like a blender or a vacuum cleaner. So I think that's quite harsh, but you immediately notice with the Audi that it feels very solid, well controlled. To my ears at least, it's very, very quiet. There's no rustling from the wing mirrors, from the wind passing over them. It feels like the suspension is quality sort of setup. There's no squeaking, rattling, no weirdness there. It just feels like a very mature, very solid car. Even going over bumps, you feel the bumps, but it doesn't bang or crash. Big bump there, just nice, quite calm. It's not a particularly encouraging car to drive quickly. It feels quite heavy. It needs a bit of encouragement. If you go round a roundabout, it kind of does it, and it's got plenty of grip, but it's not a car that you'd go out for a fun drive in. But it is quite a calm car. Even the weirdly sort of shaped steering wheel, which isn't round, feels fine. The steering's quite heavy, quite overweighted, but again, I think that's possibly to give this car a feeling of solidity. And everything does feel nicely put together, I have to say. I don't think this is an exciting car. Mind you, it's a family SUV, it's got enough power, but it's not fast by any means. And then it does have paddles behind the steering wheel to increase the brake regen on the left-hand side, and that works really quite nicely actually, that's slowing us properly. And then you can decrease it from the paddle on the right-hand side. Again, really nicely worked. I'm quite impressed with that. And so to the Volkswagen ID.4. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing as we did in the Audi. So we're going to do the same route, the same time, and we're going to test to see vaguely how loud it is. I've got the aircon set to exactly the same, so on fan speed 2. The suspension settings are the same, or the equivalent in each car, and I've got my decibel meter in largely the same place. This is punk science, this is drive-by science. It's not lab-based science. My route here is about 6 miles long. I'm doing 2 sets of decibel testing on the same road. The weather conditions are exactly the same. But immediately, I think the Volkswagen is slightly noisier. I can hear more hissing from the tyres. So even though it's not a loud car, you can immediately sort of feel a small difference in terms of the noise that's generated in the cabin. It's not unpleasant, it's like white noise, but it's like shh, you can hear from the tyres. Now we're going to have to go at the same speeds for all of our testing moments. One of the things I think you do notice is that the Volkswagen immediately just feels a little bit cheaper. Now, some of that could be that I expect the Audi to be more quality. but it's like the steering wheel feels lighter, and it's not the steering weight, it's the fact that the steering wheel itself feels a little bit less solid. And we're just going to come up to the same place where we're going to do a little bit of decibel testing. So we're going to do 30 miles an hour, just slow down a little bit, and the Volkswagen is doing pretty much exactly the same as the Audi. So even though I think this car sounds louder than the Audi, it's not. It's still saying between 75 and 80 decibels. So I don't know whether my ears are more sensitive than my phone, but this car looks to be pretty much exactly as noisy as the Audi. Now, I thought that the Audi was quieter. That surprised me. Other than that, this car just feels a little bit less composed than the Audi. The Q4's got that kind of solidity to it, and I think this car, it's slightly bobblier. Like, we're going to hit a bump in a second where the Audi just sucked it up. It's the same speed. Yeah, for sure. There's a little bit more jolt. I don't know what that is to do with. Possibly it's got cheaper damping. Perhaps it's been set up differently. The steering is also more gloopy. It doesn't centre as well. It's not quite as precise, and I do think it's rumbling more. I can hear the suspension working. There's a bit of wind rustle around the wing mirrors. It's also not got the paddles behind the steering wheel for the brake regeneration. Now, you can put it into a brake regeneration mode. You rock the gear selector again towards D to put it into B mode, but then when I let off the throttle at 36 miles an hour, it's fairly gentle in its operation. Now, that's fine, but I would prefer a slightly more aggressive brake regen mode. And I actually really like paddles behind the steering wheel. That's one real advantage to the Audi. I think that being able to knock on and off your brake regen is really useful, and the ID.4 doesn't have it. Again, full acceleration. It's nippy, but it's not quick. They do feel pretty similar in acceleration. So they'll get down a road, but they're not going to stun you. But it doesn't feel as coherent and as solid as the Audi, I've got to say. You wouldn't be disappointed by this until you drove one of the other two. Yeah, it's noisier. But I'll tell you what, now it's time for the cheapest of the three, which is the ŠKODA Enyaq 80. It's worth noting that this particular car is on quite big wheels, so it might make it a bit noisier and a bit harder riding, but immediately this car feels more reactive. And it's weird because I know this should feel pretty much the same, but this feels lower and it feels smaller, even though it's very definitely not. That's a strange thing, to jump from one to the other immediately and get an impression. So it's no faster. That's no faster than the other two, but the steering's more direct. You can feel that straight away. So even when you're maneuvering around a car park, you can feel that the steering is more direct. But one thing I did notice about the Enyaq as soon as I got in it, where the Volkswagen has an instrument binnacle up here, the gear selector is a rotary controller on the right hand side, and the Audi has a little stubby gear selector down here, which is like a little rocker push button thing. The ŠKODA is a mix of the two. So the ŠKODA still has the same center console touchscreen as the VW. Some of the graphics are a little bit more playful, less serious than the Audi, but also they do look a little bit cheaper. I've got everything set exactly the same. So I've got the fan speed on 2 at the same temperature. We're on the same road, got the decibel meter in the same place, and we're coming up to the same bit of road. So I'm going to slow down to 30. The ŠKODA is very slightly noisier. Not an awful lot, but it does register more towards the 80 than the 75 to 80 which the other cars did. So the ŠKODA is slightly noisier than the other two. I would actually agree with. You can hear a little bit more. Again, you can hear the tyres working. Not so much from the wing mirrors, but it does feel slightly noisier. We're going to hit this big bump again. We've hit it in all the other cars. It's better than the VW. Not quite as compliant as the Audi, but because you get that extra response from the steering, you don't mind it. In fact, I would say quite comprehensively, this Enyaq is the more sporting one to drive. It's not a sports car, but I would say this is the most fun by some distance. Where the Audi is all serious-faced and kind of all about getting down the road with the minimum of fuss, this is actually all right. This feels quite peppy. It feels quite keen to turn. And in another mix of Audi and ŠKODA, it's got brake regeneration paddles behind the steering wheel. So again, you increase it with the left-hand paddle and it's better. It's really good. It's bringing it to a complete stop, and you can decrease it with the right hand pedal. They don't feel as nice as the ones in the Audi because they're plastic, but they work the same way and I find them really useful. Isn't it strange? It's like the ŠKODA has more Audi bits in it than the VW does. And actually, the ŠKODA's better for it. This is confusing because I actually prefer driving the ŠKODA than either of the other two. That's interesting. It's not blown my mind, but it's very obvious when you drive these cars back to back, they are actually quite different. It's quite comforting, really. It's weird because these cars should be pretty much exactly the same, and you know what? They're not. They are completely different.
If you were to ask me to do a blind road test of these three, which would be incredibly dangerous obviously, I'd probably rank them Audi and ŠKODA joint first, though they do have different strengths, with the VW third. I wasn't expecting that.
So, a conclusion. Now these three cars might all pretty much have the same bones, but they do remarkably feel very distinct. Although it does depend what kind of specs and trims you have them in, so if you get confused by that, please do log on to electrifying.com and we'll help you sort it all out.
The Audi costs just over 48 grand for the 40 model, but the car is quieter, has a nicer interior and generally feels more plush than its sister cars. Yes, it costs more, it isn't quite as big, and you can option it to the sky, but I can see where your money goes, which is kind of comforting. I wasn't expecting the difference to be that stark.
I think the issue here is that this ŠKODA Enyaq starts at about £43,250, which for me is remarkable value. If you get an ID.4 in the right spec to match up, it's about £47,000, which is perilously close to an Audi Q4 e-tron Sport at 48. Now this is where I think the mismatch comes. I can see why you'd buy the Audi, because it's comforting. It's a grown-up car that feels very much like an Audi should. It feels quality, it feels very nice, it feels like a premium car. I think that the ŠKODA is bigger, you get more toys, and it handles with more sort of verve and ability, which makes it a really attractive car if you want to save some money and also have the space. The ID.4 is the surprise car here for me, because that car feels slightly less quality, it's not as good to drive, and actually it's quite a lot of money. Me, being a cheapskate, I want the Enyaq because I think it offers better value, but I can see why you might buy the Audi. In fact, the only car here I would advise you not to buy is the Volkswagen ID.4, and that is a surprise.
If you want to know more about exact specs and pricing on any of our three cars or any of their competitors, then please do log on to electrifying.com and we'll help you sort out the details, because we're here to clear the air.